With your host, Andrew Donaldson. This is Heard Tell.
Welcome back to Heard Tell. Okay, when we got congressional questions, this is the guy that's got the answers. He covers Congress for The Independent. He's also an MSNBC contributor, formerly The Washington Post. He moves, he shakes, he gets things done. He knows people. He talks to people, which is what we're going to talk about today. Our good friend, Eric Garcia. Great to have you back, my friend.
Good to be back.
Hey, I love what you've written in The Independent here because let's start big picture and then we'll zoom back in for a second.
Let's go.
People talk about, right now, because we have the congressional hearings with January 6th. We just did the gun legislation. We have the Supreme Court stuff with not just abortion, but also a big environmental ruling getting ready to come down the pike.
Yeah.
We have
in a few minutes right now, actually, literally.
Yeah. What's West Virginia versus EPA. It's why I'm kind of keeping an eye on it. Things like this, but this all revolves around the Congress and the Senate, but we talk about it usually in political terms and things like that. We don't talk about the mechanics of how Congress actually works. And that's where you start here. When you're covering Congress, we know about the gaggles. We know about meeting people in the rotunda. We know about the committee hearings. Talk just a minute as somebody that's there, the actual machinations of day-to-day business. There's a rhythm and there's a method to this. And that's a part of a lot of these stories that gets left out, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. I think one of the things a lot of people don't recognize is, and I've talked about this in the past, is that the House of Representatives, for better or for worse, is basically a jalopy. It's basically, at this point, the two sides barely talk to each other at this point. So as a result, that's why you see a lot of the legislation getting done on the Senate side, because they recognize that they actually need to pass a bill. So, for example, the bipartisan infrastructure bill was done on the Senate side, and the gun legislation was the most recently passed was done on the Senate side. And a big reason for that is because of the filibuster. What's interesting, what I've noticed, is that ever since January 6th, there are a lot of hard feelings on the House side. And of course, it was revealed last week that multiple members of the House asked for pardons. On the Senate side, the weird thing is, and Kirsten Gillibrand has talked about this with me, is that for the most part, it's not like anybody's forgiven Josh Hawley or Ted Cruz, but for the most part, because of the way the Senate's set up, they've moved on. And they kind of have to work together because there's fewer of them and because there's the filibuster, they have to work together. So one of the other things I think that's important to recognize that, and so what I wrote this piece about Senator Tom Tillis, is that a lot of times one of the things that benefits is that at least on the Senate side, there's a real inclination to negotiate, not let staff negotiate and let the senators negotiate among themselves. Otherwise, things break down. And I think that was really one of the things that allowed for both the infrastructure bill and the gun bill to get through, was that they kind of didn't let the staff get involved. They kind of just did it, mano a mano.
Yeah, and there's one other part to that we need to touch on before we get into the specifics here. You talk about the staff negotiating as opposed to the senators. I know we had our friend Jim Swift on, who staffed both the House and the Senate in a previous life before becoming a writer. He's talked about this on the program. The turnover of staff in the House is one of the real driving factors of how the House works, because you're running for election basically once a year, because it's every 2 years, the election cycles. Their staff turns over so much. Senate, you have Senate staffers that have been there 20, 30 years sometimes. It's a totally different beast. And when you're talking about effective government, like passing negotiated legislation, the House just has some institutional things against them, whereas the Senate, it's kind of built in to have things work because you got people that are there longer, they're more secure, all that. That's something that you see as a reporter that the general public probably doesn't think of, but it's a huge factor in how these things happen.
Yeah, it absolutely is. Being a Senate, one of the interesting things about it, that I noticed, was that during the January 6 hearings was the Cassidy Hutchinson testimony. What was interesting to me is that I probably know 10 or 15 different Cassidy Hutchinsons, or Cassidy's Hutchinson. I don't know what the plural of that is. But they're they're often young, they're often fresh out of college, they're often very fresh faced, and they're not with a lot of experience. So there's just a lot of staff turnover, and just because of the high metabolism of the house, a lot of people get run out very easily. There aren't that many. There are some lifers, don't get me wrong. There's some people who stay there for a long time, but most times people will usually jump over to the Senate side. There's also just like a House office is just smaller to manage. Whereas the Senate, there are plenty of lifers, and there's plenty of people who get things done on the day-to-day basis and who manage their bosses. And then of course there are some, I don't think I'm speaking out of turn. The Senate is a lot older than the House. And as a result, for some of the members of the Senate who might not be all there all the time, the Senate staffers might carry the load a little bit more. There were talks about this when Strom Thurmond was a senator, that his staff ran things. There were talks about Robert Byrd, how when he wasn't there for the most part toward the end, from West Virginia. So the Senate's, it's not more glamorous, I'd say, but there is more of I guess you could say, a veneration of Senate staff, because these are people who get stuff done on a regular basis.
Yeah, Eric Garcia, fine reporter, joining us. Okay, this leads us to the Tom Tillis piece you wrote, and we've linked to it in the show notes. Make sure you read the full piece. But, one of our founding principles here is things don't happen in a vacuum. They have it in a sequence. Walk us through who Tom Tillis is, because he's not that well nationally known. Of course, you and me both have ties to North Carolina, so we know maybe a little bit more than the average bear anyway. But walk us through the sequence, because like you just said, once you get to the Senate and once you're there for a second term, especially because now you got committee assignments and things, you have power, but there's a process to get in there. How did Tom Tillis get to be a player in the U.S. Senate?
Yeah, so Tom Tillis, I think he's one of those people who, again, he doesn't emit a lot of, he's not on conservative talk radio, or he's not on conservative media as much as like a Ted Cruz or a Josh Hawley. And he doesn't, and he, as of right now, he's not a chairman or anything of a big committee right now, but he's slowly but surely become one of the more effective Republican senators. And part of that is because he got his start in the Cornelius, Mecklenburg area of North Carolina. For a while, he was involved with like in the area around Lake Norman, which is incidentally where Donald Trump has property. And what happened is he just moved up the ranks in the local politics before getting elected in the North Carolina legislature in 2006, I believe. Then in 2010, then what happened is, of course, in 2008, Barack Obama won North Carolina. But in Charlotte Magazine, there's a great profile of him in Charlotte Magazine from when he was running for Senate. North Carolina Republicans didn't do that badly that year in North Carolina. So there was this feeling that maybe they could win. So what Tillis did is he basically left his job at IBM, because in North Carolina, there's a part-time legislature. And he just basically traveled across the state, recruiting candidates, campaigning for them. And then in 2010, Republicans, for the first time in more than a century, take over both houses of the legislature. 2012, his buddy from Charlotte, Pat McCrory, becomes the governor. And really, at that point, because they haven't been in power for so long, they just ramrod through a lot of conservative legislation. That really gives Tillis the impetus to run for Senate in 2014. And of course, he's running against Kay Hagan. And that was, I think it was the most expensive Senate race at the time. And it was a blood feud. That was the first Senate race I ever covered. And it was ugly. It was nasty. There was a lot of mudslinging. And Tillis narrowly won that race, but I think only 45,000 votes. Hagan actually did better than people than she probably could, than like a lot of other Democrats, but it was just a bad year for Democrats. Tillis, for the first term, he really doesn't stand out that much, but what he does do is he really tries to become somebody who Democrats can do business with. He said in 2016, he says, if they don't do criminal justice reform, I'm not running for another term. And then the Senate Judiciary Committee, he helps negotiate criminal justice reform with Democrats like Cory Booker. And then, of course, what happens is in 2020, Cal Cunningham runs against him, and of course has that sexting scandal. And Tillis, you could argue he probably would have won that seat because Joe Biden just didn't campaign that much in North Carolina. But the other thing you could argue is that he just got lucky. But depending on who you ask, whatever did happen is since then he's accumulated a lot of trust and respect, enough trust and enough goodwill from Senate leadership, and enough respect from Democrats that he's somebody who they could negotiate with.
In other words, we used to just call this stuff politics. Like, hey, he went out and raised for all these other candidates. Now it's his turn. Hey, he's easy to work with on stuff. So we now have like this new breed of politics where it's so online and it's so party focused and so ideologically focused. He's almost like an old school politician where he just kind of goes and does the job, doesn't he?
Yeah, he does the job. Make no mistake, he's a conservative. I don't want to say that he's a
sure.
moderate.
I just mean mechanically, like he does
mechanically,
the job.
Like there are the people who, to your point, he's the last of the dying breed. I think because, like, for example, to your point, Senator Rob Portman is retiring this year. He's another. I guess you could say. I think the distinction is not. And Amy Walter has discussed this at the Cook Political Report, who's like the smartest woman I know in the world. Smartest person I know in the world, probably. There are what I call governing Republicans, and there are firebrands. And Rob Portman and Roy Blunt and Pat Toomey, all of whom are retiring this year, are what I call, and Richard Burr are governing Republicans. They're conservatives, but they care about, landing the plane. Then there are your Ted Cruz's and your Josh Hawleys and your John Neely Kennedys, who focus mostly on, optics. And I think, Tillis, one reason why he doesn't earn the ire of Democrats, and one reason why his Democratic challengers don't raise as much money as like your Amy McGraths or your Jamie Harrisons or your John Ossoffs or your Raphael Warnocks, is he hasn't put himself out in the forefront as somebody who does that many offensive things to Democrats, and he's not in Senate leadership for now. So that kind of inoculates him from Democratic outrage. But in the same respect, I think what it does is that because he cares about governing and he cares about actually landing the plane and not just being on Ben Shapiro's podcast all the time, he a lot of conservatives don't necessarily trust him. So I think that's the real distinction. I actually used to say when North Carolina passed the bathroom bill, that was under Speaker Tim Moore, his successor. I used to say that never would have gone to a vote in the General Assembly if he were Speaker, not because he wasn't, opposed to LGBTQ rights. He is, but it's because he knew that was bad for business.
Yeah, and you said something key there too, I think, to key in on is with somebody like Tillis, because he's not in leadership, there's always been this group, whatever the makeup of the Senate is, there's always this floating group, gang of 4, gang of 6, gang of 8, whatever. There's always this floating group that's not actually in leadership, but they're the ones getting done. There was reporting that Mitch McConnell basically literally told the Democrats, like, hey, I can't touch this, but go talk to XYZ and Tillis was on that list that McConnell told him, like, no, you go talk to them, they'll hash it out, and then we'll go from there. That's kind of not unusual for the Senate, and he's become that kind of a guy.
Right. There are certain people who, because they have good relationships with Democrats, because they come with states where there are a lot of Democrats, there's this feeling that, well, we can get this done. The other person who is like that is Senator John Cornyn, who, again, is a very conservative senator, former Attorney General of Texas. And in this case, after the shooting in Uvalde, McConnell basically, both of them I should say sit on judiciary, so that the Judiciary Committee. So this is their jurisdiction. McConnell basically said he realized he had to do something, and he realized if they didn't pass gun legislation now, then Democrats would try to get rid of the filibuster, and then they do it next time they get in office, and then it's game over. So this was basically his way of saying it. He says, you can't negotiate with me, but you can negotiate with Cornyn, who's a former whip, and you can negotiate with Tillis, who you've negotiated with the past on infrastructure. And that's how and then basically what happened is, from what I understand, is that initially they said Chris Murphy, who represents Connecticut, and Sinema, they were the two people negotiating with Cornyn, and then Sinema said we need another Republican, and that's how Tillis came about, and being the fourth guy on this team. And then, of course, there were 16 other senators, part of a larger group that negotiated that final deal.
Yeah, Eric Garcia from The Independent. We're talking the Senate. We're talking Tom Tillis, a great piece he wrote. We're going to take a quick break. When we come back, we're going to get into how that gun legislation actually went through. We're also going to talk about some politics. Anytime you are trying to moderate as a Republican, you're going to run afoul of the Trump camp. He not only went afoul of it, he kneecapped one of them. We'll get into that in his code reading of Madison Cawthorn. More with Eric Garcia right after this on Heard Tell.
Yep.
Welcome back to Heard Tell. Having a blast talking to our good friend Eric Garcia. He does great work. Make sure you're following him. He writes for The Independent, MSNBC, other places from time to time. All right, buddy. We've talked about Tom Tillis, how the Senate works. We walked through how Tom Tillis became, he's not a shot caller, but he talks to all the people before the shots are called. I think that's probably the fair way of explaining this. Let's talk the gun legislation real quick. Let's just set aside the particulars of it because, a lot of this was kind of shining up stuff that was already existing. There's some argument over what it actually accomplishes, but they passed something, which 2 months ago you would have said that would have never happened. How did the mechanics of this legislation get passed?
The mechanics of it are really interesting because I think that there was really this feeling. I think it's important to say there are a few things. I wrote about this. It was interesting because I remember when the negotiations began. I should say I've been a journalist now for, professionally for 8 years. And that means that I've been covering politics in Washington ever since. So I've been covering Washington's response to gun violence for a long time now. And to the point that I'm just kind of like, this is, nothing's going to happen on guns. But the thing that changed, I think, but then, I noticed when the negotiations with Cornyn and Tillis and Sinema began, and Murphy, there was this general feeling of goodwill. And I think there are three things that I would attribute it to. One is that the National Rifle Association is just not as strong as it used to be. A lot of liberals like to think of the NRA's power as just the money that it gives to candidates. That's not the real thing. It's the NRA's ability to scare the bejesus out of its members and mobilize them that I think is the real power. But since the NRA's had a lot of money troubles and it's kind of gone and it's tried filing for bankruptcy, that was one thing, is that it just couldn't mobilize the troops. I think the other thing was that Democrats as a whole were unified on this. The last time there was gun legislation in 2013, 4 Democrats defected. Now, basically, all Democrats, including Joe Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema was one of the negotiators, they're basically unified on it. The same for the House. And I think that was a big factor, and there was a trifecta. So you had a president who supported it, you had a Democratic House, Democratic Senate, and basically all they needed was a few Republicans. And then the other thing I think was that there was a genuine trust. I think that, as I said earlier, McConnell knew he needed to pass something. Otherwise, the moment Democrats get a filibuster-proof, get 52 or 53 seats and a Democratic majority and a Democratic president, there is going to be an assault weapon ban. There is going to be a raising the age to 21. So we felt like I need to do this to stave that off and not make it a campaign issue. And I think it worked. And I think the last thing was that there had been already a few bipartisan deals in the past 2 or 3 years or so. There was a bipartisan deal on COVID negotiations. There was a bipartisan deal on infrastructure. A lot of the same players who were part of the infrastructure deal were part of this. So there was generally this feeling that we know how to do this and we can do this. So let's do it. So I think that's what led to it.
Yeah. And the other interesting thing about this particular piece of gun legislation was the initial people that came out and supported it were all either not up for election or were retiring or moving on or whatever. But they did expand it a little bit. Our progressive friends aren't going to like this, so y'all just grab your chairs real hard. This is going to be a rough 2 minutes, but I just got to lay this out there. When Manchin and Sinema had all that pressure on them to get rid of the filibuster, they both used the argument, no, the filibuster lets us negotiate things. And they got absolutely racked over social media and campaign ads. They got destroyed online for it. They've got some scoreboards going up now with some really important stuff, even for progressives, for moderates. They're putting wins on the board does that argument get a little fleshing out now? I mean, they're never going to get an apology or anything, but they're actually kind of getting some stuff done here.
Well, what I said about this at the beginning when I wrote about this during the negotiations was I said Sinema had the most to gain and the most to lose from this. Because if Cornyn and Tillis walked away, then the immediate thing that progressives would say was, you see, her relationships with the Republicans don't even work out that much. They don't actually get things done. But if it worked, then she could go back to Democratic voters in Arizona in 2020. She's not up for re-election this year. She's up in re-election in 2024. She could say, I got an infrastructure bill. I got gun legislation. We didn't need to get rid of the filibuster. So re-elect me. And I think that she has a case to be made. That's not to say that there aren't going to be people, particularly Democratic primary voters, who are still not unhappy with her, but she can make the case. Manchin is, of course, in a very different situation. He's in a state where Trump won every county. He has to work with Republicans. Sinema can now say, look, I rack up, like, while AOC gets a lot of retweets and, a lot of other people, I actually get things done. You could argue that this gun bill was not everything that they wanted. And in the same way, you could argue that passing the bipartisan infrastructure bill allowed for Build Back Better to die on the vine. But she could very easily say, hey, I actually do stuff and it works. So she has an argument to be made.
Yeah. And the other thing there is, and we'll delve into this some other time, the Senate is an exclusive club. There's only 100 of them.
It is.
And even bipartisan across parties, they like to have a say in who they're working with every day. And I think they're looking at states like Arizona and that absolute dumpster fire of a primary they're getting ready to have. And they're looking at Kristen Sinema and Joe Manchin in West Virginia going, you know what, whatever comes after that's going to be worse. Let's not burn her on this. There's definitely stuff like that happens in the U.S. Senate, and they think that way.
No question. I mean, I think that's very, I'll say this about Mitch McConnell, and I can't speak for the rest of them, but I can say this: McConnell is very strategic, and McConnell, as much as conservatives may hate him for it, he remembers 2010 when Sharon Engel blew that race against Harry Reid. And he remembers
I was living in Vegas at the time. I remember it vividly. Whatever you saw in the national media, it was 3 times worse on the ground. It was bad.
Right. She was unelectable. And then she blew what should have been, an easy race. And then Christine O'Donnell blew that race in 2010 against Chris Coons. And then in 2012, you of course had Todd Akin and Richard Murdoch. McConnell recognizes sometimes where he's just like, look, it might be better for us to hold off on this. And that's not to say he doesn't win. He probably would love to see Mark Kelly lose, but he's probably looking at what Mark Brnovich is doing and what Blake Masters is doing in Arizona. And he's probably like, this is going to be bad and this will be a headache. And I'm sure he probably, even though he's endorsed Herschel Walker, he probably is looking at that with, some sweater under the collar. And it wouldn't surprise me. So I think that it's, again, you're right. It is these are very strategic people, and they do it would surprise people how much, for example, Josh Hawley and Kristen Gillibrand work together. It would surprise people how much Chuck Grassley and Elizabeth Warren work together, but they do on good government stuff. Rob Portman gets along really well with Sherrod Brown, A, because they're both Ohioans, but B, they also just care about landing the plane. So to your point, it is a very professional club. And even, another example, a lot of people, as much as people may rag on him, and I've given my fair share of criticism of him, Marco Rubio and Rick Scott, in 2018, Rubio didn't campaign for Rick Scott because he liked working with Bill Nelson, the Democrat who was the senator at the time.
Yeah, now head of NASA. There's definitely a pro wrestling element to the Senate where they do one thing in front of the camera and then they go behind the camera like, all right, how do we get to the next thing? Real quick, senatorial power, of course, is not just in legislating. It's also in picking candidates. We talked about how Tom Tillis made his bones in politics by picking winners and candidates. That's how you build up a base. That also means when it's time to run somebody, that's the guy to go to. Let's talk about the soon-to-be former, thank God, representative from out around Asheville, Madison Cawthorn. I called it the Code Red. If you don't understand the reference, because we're starting to get old, my friend, I'm sorry to tell you, but that's A Few Good Men. That's they took the guy out that was the problem. This was a Code Red. If you go and you understand how politics works, a phone call got made and said, okay, we've had enough. Let's get rid of him. Tom Tillis, it turns out, was the catalyst behind that, or more specifically, his staff in his office and those deep, deep North Carolina ties. Walk us through that one real quick, because that's an exercise in power when you can take out a sitting congressman just because you've had enough. That's pretty impressive flexing.
It is an impressive flex. And I think so. There's the stuff that a lot of people know about Madison Cawthorn that angered people, which was the jokes about him talking on that podcast about cocaine and orgies. That was just the last straw. The real thing that heaved off Tillis was last year in redistricting, because every year states had to do redistricting, and every 10 years, I should say, and they had to redraw new maps. Cawthorn was being cute, acting cuter than he was, and he decided to switch districts and run against and run in a district that was going to be made for a guy by the name of Tim Moore, who's the Speaker of the North Carolina House of Representatives. That angered a lot of people, because Moore was supposed to run for that seat. He's the Speaker of the House, and that was Tillis' successor. He also threatened to, quote unquote, primary the hell out of anybody who voted for the infrastructure bill. And of course, Tillis was one of the negotiators on that bill. And then afterward, he bragged about bringing broadband to Western North Carolina. And that angered Tillis to no end. And I think what also some people worry is that by him trying to switch to that district that included the Charlotte area, some people thought that maybe one day he wanted to run for Senate and primary Tillis. But whatever, and so it was also maybe him protecting his own territory. But for a lot of reasons, Cawthorn didn't do the job. It's, one thing a lot of people don't recognize. So Cawthorn, of course, ran against a friend of Mark Meadows's when Meadows went to go become White House Chief of Staff. And that, that's fine to be an insurgent, but what happens is afterward, you usually have to rebuild your repair relationships. Cawthorn never did that. He kept on burning bridges so that when he needed his friends, he didn't have any. And I think that's ultimately why it was, one thing after another that finally Tillis and the rest of the North Carolina Republican establishment said, okay, enough. And Tillis said that Phil Berger, who's a state senator, was the one who, kind of motivated him to get behind Chuck Edwards. So that was ultimately the reason, was that there was enough infrastructure to take out Cawthorn. So I think a lot of people have said, why did Madison Cawthorn lose, but Lauren Boebert didn't? Well, for the fact of the matter is that Colorado has a Democratic governor and 2 Democratic senators. So there's not a lot of power within the Republican Party to fundraise and neutralize somebody. And in the same respect, Lauren Boebert wasn't talking smack about other Republicans. She was talking smack about Democrats. So that's ultimately what led to it.
Yeah, and let's not pretend here this is still some politics involved. Cawthorn had viable competition in his primary where Boebert and some of these others didn't. If they had one, they might go after, the reason they haven't done this, somebody's like, well, why didn't they do that, Marjorie Taylor Greene? Because they don't have a candidate running with her that could win. If they had one, they'd probably do it. Let's be adults. They knew they could beat him, and then that's part of the calculus here as well.
There was already blood in the water. He also had multiple law violations for, trying to bring a gun on a plane, and speeding tickets and having his license suspended. Marjorie, there wasn't a viable candidate who could run against her in a primary. She had a primary challenger this last year, this past go around, but, Brian Kemp didn't get behind this challenger. None of the big power brokers in Georgia got behind it. So it just kind of was allowed to wither on the vine. So as you said, it's all about, can this be done? Do we have a good candidate? Do we have all the things lined up? In Cawthorn's case, it just lined up.
Eric Garcia, you're fantastic. We love having you on. We appreciate you being a regular on Heard Tell. Till we get you back, let folks know where they can follow you. Your writing. This piece is in the Independent. We'll make sure to link to it. Please make sure you read and share it. Let folks know about your social media and everything you got going on, my friend.
You can follow me at Eric M. Garcia. On Twitter, you can follow me on Instagram at Eric M. Garcia 14. I, of course, write for The Independent. I'm a columnist for MSNBC. My book, We're Not Broken, Changing the Autism Conversation, came out last year through HarperCollins. It is coming out in paperback August 3rd with a new afterword about the COVID-19 pandemic. So that is coming out in paperback. And as always, it's always fun being on here.
Yeah, and when the paperback comes back, I already told you, we want to have you on and kind of rehash that because we covered the book when it first came out because those are human interest stories. I'd love to update some of that. So we'll definitely have you on to talk about the book. Great book.
We'll be doing it soon, my friend.
We'll put a link in there for that too. All right, Eric Garcia, you're the best, buddy. Appreciate your time today, sir.
Take care.
Thank you, sir. Welcome back to Heard Tell. Contributor. She's also at the Reason Foundation looking at the Personal Integrity Project and some policy analysis. Jen Sidorova, how are you, ma'am? Glad to have you with us.
Good to be here.
Hey, thrilled to have you. Okay. You've been doing some writing. Let's start kind of big picture for a second. Everybody understands that pensions is a big problem in America, especially on a federal level. We understand pensioners, and that has a lot of different forms from public pensions, even the Medicare system, things like that. You took an angle on this, though, that on the municipal level, and we know there's a lot of cities that have been crippled with pensions, you actually found an example of some good news for pension. I'm all for some good news. We've had a lot of bad news lately. Talk about Jacksonville and the pension system that you wrote about, because it's really nice to see a well-run government and some good news in this front, isn't it?
Yes, definitely. So what we focus in the Pension Integrity Project is the state and local pensions. So not really like the social, not the social security or anything like that, but the local and state pensions that pay for the public service workers, teachers, firefighters, and police officers within the states or municipalities. And so Jacksonville is one of the examples of a municipality that back in 2017, they turned off the defined benefit pension plan for the new hires, and they put all the new hires into 401k style plan. So all of that sounds kind of all this terminology, but let me try to explain it. Defined benefit plan, the pension plan, is the kind of plan that a lot of public sector workers have, like teachers and police and firefighters, as I've mentioned. And so the way the benefit is calculated is that there's a formula that takes into account the number of years that they worked with a particular employer. It takes into account their salaries, and then it's calculated. And they kind of get a benefit each month. So that's how pensions work. And the employer is responsible to provide that pension no matter what. So even if they don't have enough money saved up, they still need to find a way to provide for those pensions. Those pensions are guaranteed by constitutions. What Jacksonville did, they switched the new hires to 401k style plan. That's more like a, we also call it defined contribution plan. That's more similar to what workers outside of the public sector have. It's a 401 style plan. And what that means is that it is dependent on how the markets do. And the risk is kind of carried more so by the employee than employer. And so that's what Jacksonville did. And now we see a lot of positive dynamic for them, because for once their credit rating was improved. So they had an upgrade, and now they will have lower interest rates on all the loans they will take out. So all the money freed up will go towards their public services, like infrastructure, parks, recreation, everything that all the public services that their citizens need.
Now, I'm just looking at, there's a fiscal side and a political side of this. Let's just look at the fiscal side for a second, since you went through the technicalities of this. The numbers are pretty astonishing. 585 million added, over 155 million to the pension reserves. Since that charge was put in place, over 715 million has been used to grow Jacksonville economy and invest back, like you talked about. That's eye-popping by anybody's standards. Does the public in Jacksonville realize that? I mean, I know we're talking retirement funds and people watch those things, but was there an immediate reaction to people to those kind of numbers? Because even somebody that really doesn't understand the nuts and bolts of that, that's a lot of zeros going on the plus side of the ledger. I got to think people had to be happy about that pretty quickly. Yeah.
Right. So I do believe there was a lot of coverage of that, both when the reform was taking place. And right now, I'm not so sure. I don't see as much of that in the news. It's something more that the public finance professional would understand rather than the general public, unless they make that sort of connection, unless the officials go out there and they talk to the press and they highlight. So, and in this particular case, it was actually highlighted in the media. And now that I'm thinking of that, and one of the officials actually mentioned that, you know, the freed up money will go towards roads, bridges, parks, libraries, public health and safety. So it will affect the daily life of those communities. But since you brought up this eye-popping number, I have another significant number to share with you, and the total, and that's the total public pension debt across the country, which right now is pushing $1.5 trillion. And that number is really huge. And that's how much money these public pensions lacking to. So in a way, this is how much less they have than they should. And kind of to give you another visual of that is that the public pensions right now are funded at roughly 72%. So they only have 72 cents per each dollar saved up for those pensions. Now in 2021, because of the very high interest, because of the very high asset returns, that number increased a little bit. Instead of 72, it was 80 in 2021. But now we're going to see some negative returns, some negative market asset returns, and it's going to go down. So like that, like if I would say the funded ratio would still hang out around 72, 73. Although we had like a very good year for asset returns, for market gains. We had a very good year in 2021, but this year will pretty much wipe it out.
Yeah, I'm not super great with math, but I know 30% of 1.5 trillion is a whole lot of money to be hanging in the air on. Jen Sidorova joining us. That's the fiscal side. You just touched on it because this is a ticking bomb type of problem. Let's talk about the political side of this. Pensions are one of those in a lot of places, especially major U.S. cities. They're almost sacrosanct. People will not touch these. They don't want to try to reform them. What was the political environment in Jacksonville that they actually not only reformed it, but reformed it in a really productive way that only 5 years, that's a pretty fast physical return on something like this. Talk about the political calculation where they actually got this done when so many municipalities, you can't even bring this up, let alone do actual reform on it.
Right. So when we're talking about public pension reform, it does not necessarily have to be as drastic as what Jacksonville did. You don't necessarily have to close out defined benefit plan. In some defined benefit plans in this country are actually fully funded. So the goal of pension reform is mainly to bring the pension plan to the state where it's not impacting, the public services. It's not dragging the state or the municipality down to the point when they are having a downgrade of their risk downgrade. And it's actually just whenever the pension reform is all about making a sustainable plan that will make sure that those promises to retirees, promises to those teachers, police officers, and firefighters are actually fulfilled. And it's really the goal is to make those pension plans solvent, to put them down, the fiscal solvency path. It's not really, the point is not really to shut them down at all. And another interesting example of this pension plan, not this particular pension plan, but another successful transition from defined benefit to defined contribution was in Alaska. The reform that happened in 2006, where they also put all the new hires into defined contribution plan. It's been a while since that reform, and I recently published a working paper that looks at the retention outcomes for the workers, retention outcomes for the teachers. And what we see is that retention actually slightly improves for workers who were hired at the defined contribution, for the defined contribution plan.
Yeah. ask you this then. Jacksonville, of course, is in Florida. That's a fast growing state. There's no state taxes. There's obviously some local things that went into this. So when you look at the example of Jacksonville, and like you said, that is kind of a drastic example. What is scalable and what isn't scalable from this example, do you think, as you look, like you said, the rest of the country, this is a $1.5 trillion problem. Almost every municipality has a pension issue of some sort and manner. What is scalable? What isn't going to be scalable as we look at the rest of the country, do you think?
I think one priority that I see, one kind of sticking point that I see for a lot of plans is their assumption, their assumed rate of returns. The assumed rate of return is the assumption that they make when calculating kind of how much money they're taking in. When calculating that, the assumed rate of return helps them calculate their funded ratios, their unfunded liabilities. And it's a very important measure because this is how much money they think their assets are going to return every year. And so right now, the assumption on average is 7%. So they believe that every year their portfolio will return 7%. And if you have at all looked at your 401k, and then you will see that this assumption is a very high one, and it's a little bit unrealistic. I would say even a more realistic goal would be all the way to 6%. And some plans actually, like some plans like New York, are actually doing this. So this is something that definitely can be done. And it's also a very positive improvement for the plan in the sense that they will just set more realistic goals for themselves. And they're more likely to be back on solvency track, back to being fully funded, and to fulfill the promises to the retirees.
All right, we're talking to Jen Sidorova. She's with Young Voices and the Reason Foundation, doing some excellent work on public policy when it comes to pension. We're going to take a quick break. When we come back, we're going to talk about the rest of the country. A whole lot of problems. Like she said, 1.5 trillion. She's got some writing and some examples of what to do about that, who's in trouble, who's not. Talking public pensions, one of those things folks don't like to talk about until it's a problem, with our friend Jen. Right back after her tell, right after this. Welcome back to Heard Tell. Talking about one of them real complex subjects, but the thing is, it affects just about everybody in one way or the other. Public policy when it comes to pensions. Our friend Jen Sidorova. The reason this affects everybody, and you touched on it lightly, but let's just make sure we enunciate it clearly for everybody. The opposite of what you cover in Jacksonville is true. They made back money. They fixed their problems. That was more money for roads and bridges and firefighters and cops and teachers and whatever else. But we've seen in municipalities the reverse, though. When they don't handle their pension fund, the pension fund really becomes an albatross. And then things like teachers and firefighters and roads and playgrounds and all that other stuff, that's what starts suffering, because these pension plans can absolutely eat up a city budget for decades to come if they're not properly managed, can't they?
Right. So I think a couple of examples of really significant, kind of a fallout that was brought up from mismanaged pensions was Detroit a couple of years ago, and then Puerto Rico. So both jurisdictions had to undergo significant fiscal changes because their pensions. And this is something that, as Pension Integrity Project, as pension reform, we're trying to prevent. You never want to go to this point of almost no return when you have to, at that point, make significant drastic changes. A lot of pensions are in the state where, with a little bit of tuning, defined benefit plan could work. And this is something that just needs to be taken care of right now. It's a priority. And although, most policymakers are not going to be here when those pensions, mature like 30 years from now, when, the bill will come due, it is still like decisions that are made right now are extremely important. And another thing, the reason that why I am bringing this up is because we've seen a recent trend that that in a lot of those state pensions, what happened was that the political goals, like the prioritizing green, environmentally friendly, and social justice goals, those sort of investments. So has been taking place. Examples of that would be like divesting from a gun manufacturer or divesting from an oil producing company, and instead investing into ESGs. And this is the trend that's happening right now. And it's quite scary in a way that when it comes to, those pensions that you owe and you have to pay, what you really should be chasing is kind of sustainable, solid returns. And you should be investing into assets that are very likely, that are trusted assets, and they are very likely to bring a stable return, and not really gamble with public pension money. So that's just another thing that we've seen recently, and I wanted to highlight.
Yeah. And I think you hit something important on the head there too, is, this is a data heavy thing. This is kind of a wonky issue, but it affects very normal everyday people, even people that are non-political, because everybody wants to have some kind of a retirement. And this thing projects out 20 or 30 years over the course of a worker's lifetime. So it's kind of hard for people to get their heads around. As you've wrote about this, as you studied it at the Reason Foundation and other places, do we need to change how we discuss this in the political commentary and on our social media and stuff? The way we've discussed this over the last 20, 30 years doesn't seem like it's a real productive way. Do you think there's a better way to discuss this without maybe getting into all the nomenclature, which kind of loses people, and just talk to them on a human level of like, hey, this not only makes your retirement better, it makes our cities better. It gives more stuff to our kids for the next generation. It sets the next generation up for success. Do we need to change our nomenclature, how we talk about this issue?
Yeah, actually, a couple of years ago, I wrote that op-ed that went to Market Watch, and it talks about why pension issue is a millennial issue as well, why millennials should care about pension debt. It's precisely because of that, because the money that otherwise could be spent on public services is going towards paying, to the employees who stopped working 10 or 20 years ago, which is kind of bringing up the issue of intergenerational fairness. And it's also, like in Jacksonville, it's simply that, you're getting a lower credit score. And like any one of us, like once our credit score, if it goes down, we're going to get billed with high interest rates. And if we have a very high credit score, we get low interest rates. It's like as simple as that. So you can even bring this into this human level and translate it into these basic issues that we have to deal with in our daily lives to explain this issue. And that's what I'm trying to do as part of the Pension Integrity Project and as part of Young Voices.
Yeah, basically, if you're paying taxes, you're funding a public pension somewhere, somehow, probably a bunch of them is kind of the way to think of it. Jen Sidorova joining us. We appreciate your time. This is one of those complicated issues, but you explain it really well, so even I could understand it, and I appreciate that. I know you're writing at Reason. You've got a list of writing credits that anybody would be jealous of. I know I am looking through it. Let people know where you are on your social media until we get you back on again in the future, how they can follow you and keep up with what you have going on.
Definitely. You can find me on most social media, and my handle is the same. It's Jen_Sidorova. So I'm pretty easy to find, and you can just always Google my name and find my Reason profile, Young Voices profile, and connect with me that way.
Yep. She's got a lot of writing credits. She's doing more media, and we were lucky enough to get her here on Heard Tell, and we hope to have you back again soon, my friend. Thank you so much for the time today. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Anytime.
Thank you, man. All the music on Heard Tell is provided under a Creative Content license from monstercat.com.